Thank you, President Chris, and thank you, fellow Rotarians. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Matthew Caruana is originally from Long Beach, and coincidentally, that's where he and I first met. You guys are really slow. Currently, he lives in Johannesburg, South Africa. In 2000, he graduated from UCLA with a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology, and then obtained a master's degree from Manchester University in England in archaeology, and then went off to South Africa where he received his doctorate degree in archaeology. I used to refer to him in the house as Mr. Matthew, but since he has his PhD, I now call him Hey Matthew. He's been involved in a variety of archaeological and paleontological projects ranging from ages of 2,000 years, I can't say the words, it was 10,000 years up to 3.5 million years ago. His specialty is in the analysis of earlier Stone Age archaeology materials and excavation methods. Matthew currently works at numerous sites in South Africa, including Swartkfrans Cave, Sterkfontein Cave, and Dermidian Cave, and Amazoni Springs and Pongo World Heritage Site. I'm sure he'll tell you more about this and probably pronounce it correctly even. Anyway, today it's my pleasure then to call up our speaker with his most important title, My Son, Matthew.
All right, thank you very much. So I have the unique pleasure of being an archaeologist working in South Africa. And this is a really special place because it preserves a lot of cave sites. And in those cave sites, we find evidence of animals and culture on the landscape from the period of around 3 million to about 200,000 years ago. And so as my job, part of my sort of research, I asked the question, how did our ancestors do it? How do they survive such dangerous landscapes in this time period with only stones and bones to help them? So just to give you a little bit of a setting as to where I work in an area which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site called the Cradle of Humankind. This is not where we find our first ancestors. That is in fact a marketing gimmick. But in any case, it's roughly an area that's defined here by a large outcropping of dolomite. And dolomite is a type of carbonaceous rock that cave systems form in, and I'll discuss a little bit about why that's important. But in the south region of the Cradle of Humankind, we have a very particular valley system. This valley system is called the Blaaubank River Valley System. There's a large river that runs through this area, and roughly in line with one another, you can see that there are 4 sites all preserving evidence of some of our earliest ancestors, what we call hominids. And we'll discuss what that means in a second. I am particularly involved in research at Swartkfrans and Sterkfontein, which are less than a kilometer away from one another. And these sites preserve an amazing record. We'll talk a little bit about what we're finding there and why it's important, and how we can reconstruct the lifeways of our earliest ancestors with this evidence that we excavate from these sites. What is a hominid? That's the first sort of context question we'll answer. It is essentially a bipedal ape. So we evolved from a line of apes. We share our genetic affinities with all kinds of apes, but particularly the chimpanzee. Chimpanzee is where we split off from between the neighborhood of about, let's say, 4 to 8 million years ago. And our split with the chimpanzees, those species that would eventually evolve directly into us, are what we call hominids. And they're defined by the ability to walk upright. There's lots of evidence that we have to support them walking upright, particularly in the pelvis, the spine, and also in the skull with the positioning of the foramen magnum, where the spine articulates to the skull. Our oldest ancestry, we know, comes from East Africa, places like Chad, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Kenya. But we're not too sure about the interaction between there and South Africa. Species may have developed in either place and migrated south or north, but we do have some very, very old species in South Africa, which we'll talk about now. The major point is that within human evolution, these are the hominids sort of nicely charted out here. We find affinities or relationships between these hominids based upon their skeletal morphology. That's the size and the shape of those bones. We can draw up these maps, and what you'll quickly see is that this is a sort of bush-like structure. We have a number of living species on the landscape at the same time. Some would die out, having no contribution to our evolution. Others would go on to evolve eventually into our species. So when we're drawing up diagrams like this, we're really looking at the skeleton themselves. And if we're to boil down human evolution into trends, we would see two remarkable trends going on. The first is the enlargement and the reorganization of the brain. As we progress from hominid species to our own Homo sapiens, our brain starts to enlarge, but it also reorganizes, meaning that the connections between various brain areas, like the parietal and the frontal lobes, becomes more complex. We also see a trend towards upright walking in bipedalism. But also, culture evolves. So one thing that our early ancestors did that really gave us a head up on living in dangerous landscapes is they created tools. They would take stone rocks, they would knock them together to break off flakes. And those flakes, while a simple act, a simple process, and a simple thought, gave them a huge, huge advantage towards creating a culture of tool making. And that has had a knock-on effect that has led us right into our technology today. At 2 million years, one of the most significant things to develop is the idea of not just knocking off flakes from one stone, but to start shaping tools. So tools were shaped in very particular forms. This beautiful piece here is an Acheulean hand axe. It has this nice teardrop shape to it. We find these in Africa, we find them in China, we find them in Europe, all over the place that these hominids have spread from. And as time goes on and the modern humans, our own species, come onto the landscape, tool production becomes more complex and more focused, meaning they're shaping tools for very specific purposes, like hunting or cutting of vegetal materials. To talk a little bit about the sites that I work at, Sterkfontein and Swartkrans are some of the oldest and most important in this Blaaubank river system in South Africa. Sterkfontein is the largest site for hominid remains. Over 500 remains have come from this site. Gives us a very unique and wonderful insight into our evolution. Thousands of stone tools preserved there, and these sedimentary infills that we dig this stuff out of span from about 3 million to 200,000 years ago. I also work at Swartkfrans site. Again, very important sites, 300 plus hominid species, thousands of stone tools. And when we put all of this evidence together, we can start to reconstruct how these species have lived on the landscape and how they survived very dangerous times. Very briefly, why these sites are so important and known to us today is because of this man, Robert Broom. Now, in the early 1930s, he came to South Africa to study paleontology, and right away he found two cave sites, Sterkfontein and Swartkrans, in short succession, and they started yielding hominid remains. Now, these sites have been worked continuously and have provided a wonderful record of these species plus tools, and it all started with this man here. Ms. Ples, the skull at the top, was the first adult Australopithecus skull to be found in South Africa. It proved to the world that South Africa was a very important region for hominid evolution. And at Swartkrans, Robert Broom found evidence of two different species in the same sort of time period. So back in those days, human evolution was thought of as a linear process. One species would exist, it would evolve to the next, and so on and so forth. And he proved that this was not the case. That in fact we had a plethora of hominid species on the landscape at the same time. Now, the evidence that we take to try to reconstruct hominid lifeways really starts with the environment. It's one of the most important parts because of understanding these things, because we have to contextualize behavior. We have to understand, okay, we can look at stones and bones, but what were they doing with it on the landscape? And one of the main ways that we do this is through isotope analysis. So when we have antelope and gazelle on the landscape, if they eat bushes or trees or grasses, they will preserve different isotopes that are captured in their teeth. And we can put together a huge record of species And if some of them should be more grass-eating, we can assume that the area around these sites was grasslands. If we find more of them are subsisting on trees and bushes, we think of it as a closed environment. Now, it's never a clear picture working in paleoanthropology, so what we have found is that there is patchy sort of forest going on in this area, there's lots of river systems, but all of that is giving way to expanding grasslands. And on those grasslands, we find some very, very nasty characters. Now, this presents a significant problem with our hominid ancestors. As I said, the brain was expanding 2 million years ago. That creates a need for nutrition. We need enough protein, we need enough carbohydrates and other types of nutrition to fuel that expanding brain. The best way to go about that for our ancestors was meat. And when you're subsisting on meat, you are putting yourself in direct challenge with carnivores like these species here. Meganterion was a large saber-toothed cat about the size of a lion, hunted in open grasslands. Dinofelis, a smaller saber-toothed cat that probably hung around in forested areas, hunting style much like a leopard. Chasma prothetes, which is a hyena in the body of a cheetah. So they probably hunted in packs, but were able to run at incredible speeds. They have these long back legs that really allow them to propel themselves on the landscape. And this guy here, Pachycrocuta, is another type of hyena that was bone crusher. This thing would probably eat a whole carcass, and it took down its prey probably by grasping at their forelimbs or back limbs, crushing bones, and then waiting for them to die out, and would digest you from skin to bone to meat in whole. So this presented a significant problem for our ancestors, is how do you compete with species like this on the landscape? Here you can see just some of the drastic size ranges of these big cats and hyenas. Interestingly enough, at Swartkfrans, in the 1960s, an excavator named Bob Brain found this hominid skull cap here and found two very interesting puncture marks in that skull. Right next to this skull, he unearths a large male leopard jaw, and he was able to fit the canines of that male leopard jaw directly into those holes, meaning our ancestors were on the menu. They were hunted quite probably actively by these large carnivores on the landscapes, and his hypothesis was that we find so many hominids in these cave systems is because they're being dragged in by these large carnivores and consumed in those cave systems. So, how did they do it? Well, they did it firstly by making tools. Now, stone knapping, or the process of removing a flake from a core stone or a parent stone, is no easy task. And I would encourage you to go out and try to knock off a flake with a hammerstone and a core, but please don't, because I'm worried that you're going to smash your fingers, as I've done on a number of occasions. We have to bleed for this job to understand it well. And in any case, it's very systematic. Core stones, when an individual was taking flakes off of them, these stones were managed. The idea that you would have to walk quite a distance to get some of these materials, different types of rocks flake better, so you would preserve those rock types that flake best. And the idea here is that flaking was a managed process. And we can tell this through a refitting analysis, a sort of reverse engineering of stone flakes coming off of cores, because we can simply piece them back together again in special circumstances. Now, we're working with some of this material at Swartkfrans as we speak, where we're trying to identify what flakes might fit together and then back onto a parent stone or a core. And the interesting part about this is it shows us what these tool makers were thinking as they were rotating cores and taking off flakes systematically. The idea was that they were preserving flaking surfaces, flaking angles. It gives us a real insight into tool production, and we can see that these guys were intelligent. They were not just apes on the landscape running around like crazy. They were very organized and systematic in their tool production. Now, that's important to us because when we look at our last living ancestors, the chimpanzees, we find them using stone tools. And in fact, they use a variety of different types of stones to crack nuts in the wild, and they've been doing this for the last 4,000 years at least. They pass this information on through social learning. It's generational. So a little chimpanzee will come up next to mother as mother is cracking nuts. They will observe. they will go off, they will collect the same materials, and they will try to do it on their own. And in this way, they are learning socially without communication, but still in a very complex way that allows one generation to pass on knowledge to the next. And that's important for us to contextualize how tool-making behaviors are passed on through the generations. As we have it, when we look at tool-making under the view of neuroscience, through PET scans and CAT scans, we find that a very complex system of brain regions are activated through tool making. And in fact, these are the exact same neural networks that we use when we speak, when we use language. So what this tells us is that the process of tool making, the sort of social cohesion that it creates through learning, primed the brain essentially for those pathways that we would use to communicate in a complex way, for language. So how did they do it? They did it by increasing social cohesion and probably complex communication. Because after time goes by, as we said, tool use becomes more complex over time. It moves from flaking to shaping tools, and that's a process that can't just be passed on by observation. It has to be taught. And we think that our early hominid ancestors were extremely intelligent and extremely socially adept, to the fact that their tool making, their social reality allowed them to communicate. Thank you very much. I was told there might be some questions if anybody has. Yes.
Please. So, what is your exact specialty? What is your most passionate thing to study in this whole array?
Sure. So my specialty is this right here. So what I do as an earlier Stone Age archaeologist is I excavate tools, particularly from the period of about 3 million to 1 million years ago. This is at the point where tools were starting to be shaped, but most of what I do is look at the process of core reduction. So cores that flakes are knocked off of. And I am involved in trying to recreate whatever I can through the assemblage of stone tools that I have to try to recreate the behaviors surrounding tool production. So I look at flakes, I look at cores, I do all kinds of measurements, statistical analyses, and I essentially try to characterize a site. I will say this is how tool production happened at this particular site, and then that allows me to compare to other assemblages from different sites in an area, and we can see, is there any sort of regional variation in tool production. And the reasons responsible for that then relate to behavior, which then relate to the environment that these early ancestors are living in. So I might look at stone tools from South Africa, compare them to East Africa, or sites that are neighboring, Sterkfontein and Swartkrans.
Where do you store everything? Do you keep them at a university, or where do you?
Yeah, so as a part of the process of excavation, when I gain a permit to excavate a site, I have to have an agreement with an institution that will curate the material. And so that's usually done at a museum or a university.
Could be a stupid question, but what is the advantage of flaking? We use the flakes.
Yes, so the idea...
So saber-toothed tigers attacking you?
If a saber-toothed tiger is attacking you, what you do is make your peace with with whoever you need to, and wait for it to sort of kill you slowly.
I should also add that I'm not very comfortable around my cat.
Yeah, my cat likes to bite my hand, and it's a sort of evolutionary throwback to those times. But the advantage of using a flake was really about the serrated and sharp cutting edge that those flakes would produce. And that would allow you to then get into a carcass and butcher meat. Now, we often think about these big cats being very formidable, scary creatures, but when we look at, say, the San Bushmen, who are a sort of native people of South Africa, they would often chase lion prides off of kills for meat. And so again, the social cohesion, a bunch of upstanding apes coming at you, screaming and hollering, throwing rocks and things like this, was enough to scare off large predators. Those flakes then allowed them to butcher meat quickly. They were able to then transport that meat or whatever part of the animal that they had disarticulated back to an area where they could consume it safely. I'm not too sure who's which.
Do you have any theories on how big the hominid communities were?
That's a very good question. Demographics is a huge concern for us. We don't have any real way of putting that together because we are seeing very biased assemblages. You know, whoever died inside of a cave system, it's very few individuals when we look at probably population scale, but we think that they were very small to begin with. When we were more ape-like, and as we are expanding, as we're becoming more upright walkers and having to subsist out there on an open landscape, those numbers probably grew. And the biggest indicator of that is actually baboons in South Africa, who are mostly ground-dwelling animals. They prefer the grassland habitats, massive group size.
You know, it sounds like what you do is extremely exciting. I can't imagine you do it for free, but where does most of the funding come from, and you know how?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. The funding usually comes from the university through employment contracts, and so employment happens at a university level. But when a university hires you, they usually do it for life, and so then your pay sort of salary is dependent upon what your job is. You'll start off as a lecturer, then move to senior lecturer, then to professorships, and that's when you start making the big bucks. Big bucks to be used with a little asterisk. Different meaning from when Bill Gates says big bucks. But it really is a point of passion. Also, there is external funding that you can apply for. So there's all kinds of government grants that will support researchers for up to a 5-year period. And you know, you can make a bit of a living bouncing from grant to grant.
With you discussed this one area. Were there similar activities evolving in other locations in Africa simultaneously, or is it kind of sequential?
It's a very interesting question, and the way that we're sort of thinking about it is that we have a more of a radiation style when we're looking at, say, changes in technology. So technology doesn't pop up over the world in 2 places simultaneously. At least that's our understanding now. Give it 10 years, that may be, you know, everything I'm saying will probably be blown out of the water, but we think of everything sort of originating somewhere in Africa and radiating out, which is exactly the pattern that hominids follow as well. So for instance, Homo erectus is found in Europe and Asia, but it is a species that has definitively evolved in Africa, and with it, it would bring its technology. And so the technological patterns we see associated with Homo erectus originally started off in Africa, but over 500,000 to 1 million years, eventually would spread to the far parts of the world, including even Indonesia.
Do you have to publish?
I have to publish like a demon. Yeah, that's even as I came up here, I'm working on publications. So I'm required to publish at least 3 papers, first author papers per year. The university gets subsidies for that, which is why they whip us and drive us to publish so much, and they threaten to, you know, sort of push us to the wayside if we don't.
So, is there any way of telling that tools were discovered by accident, or is there a correlation with the brain development that maybe somebody was the Leonardo da Vinci of the caveman and he came up with this development? Is there any way of correlating development by accident or on purpose?
No, there's really no way to do that, but I will tell you an interesting story which comes from primatologists. And this is a little known sort of secret in human evolution. It's women are the real geniuses. And the reason that I say that is from chimpanzees. So when we look at chimpanzees, they have a number of you know, sort of complex tool-use behaviors they engage in. And we have to ask the question, how do these develop? Well, most of that tool-using behavior is done by females. And why is that? The females need tools to get at nutrients quickly. Why? Because they have maybe 2, 3 young hanging off their neck, you know, trying to breastfeed, so on and so forth. They have to support that life way. They need access to nutrition. And what are the men doing? Well, the males are often politicking. So they're more concerned about their social ranking and trying to take over a group and so they engage in tool use less. And so the way that I look at it as an archaeologist is that when you have a mother who is a support system for your offspring, they are more than likely probably going to engage in tool use for their own benefit because it's easy access to nutrition. So it's a speculation, but I think that if we were to look at the originators of tool use, it would be maybe between a mother and a child. A child playing around with hitting rocks because mom's cracking nuts or doing something that's a little less complex, and all of a sudden a baby or the mother starts to produce flakes by accident, by smashing that rock against an anvil where a nut is sitting, and flakes come off. And in fact, we see that same thing happening with chimpanzees. They have an anvil, they put a nut on the anvil, and as they come down, sometimes the hammerstone will slip off the nut, and it will make contact with the anvil, and the anvil shoots off these sharp splinter flakes. It's a theory, but that's about the best I can do.
How do the locals perceive what you're doing? Are they pretty supportive of you guys?
Very much so, yes. And in South Africa, there is a big movement towards local engagement. So in the olden days, you would come up to a site, you would excavate it, there may be a town nearby, and you probably have no connection to them. But nowadays, we are sort of morally and ethically obligated to inform people what is happening on or near their land. And in fact, we're trying very desperately in South Africa to get more South Africans involved in their own research. And that's, white, black, Indian, that's everybody. Because so few South Africans are interested in this time period and doing this type of thing. So local engagement is a key.
Television tells us DNA is really advanced things. Has it helped in your area?
Absolutely, yeah. DNA has been one of the revolutions of how we understand where we come from. So for instance, this split from chimpanzees, that is a fact that has come from us through DNA analysis. We have mapped our genome, and we can understand that comparing that information to the genome of chimpanzees, where our commonalities in genetics have come off. That provides a sort of chronological indicator from us. Recently, there was some groundbreaking research done in South Africa on a skeleton that's 2,000 years old from a boy that was part of a Khoisan community, another sort of indigenous population and ethnic group that probably existed in South Africa for the last 40,000 years, no joke. And in any case, this guy was a pure-blood Khoisan boy. They mapped his DNA, and they found that comparing it to different other types of DNA that was split from modern humans from our most recent ancestor, Homo heidelbergensis, which is an ancestor we share with Neanderthals, happened about 300,000 years. So we know exactly now, pretty much, we're starting to understand the timing of the split of our own species, Homo sapiens sapiens, from, say, something like Neanderthals.
One question, how do we enroll in your classes? That's incredible information. Thank you so much. We have a gift for you from the Rotary Club of Petaluma. It's a speaker for our speakers. And I'm not sure if your mom or dad ever gave you the chicken pin from our, so these chickens got ate real fast by those tigers. So that's our club's chicken pin for you as well. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. So thanks everybody, and Michael and Diane, thank you so much for bringing Matthew to us. What a fascinating talk, really appreciate it. I can see the rototeller this week, women are geniuses. That's going to be the topic. So thanks a lot. What a great meeting. People from South Africa, people from Nigeria, people from Sebastopol, from all over.